Everyone for your participation, for being here. I just want to welcome our panelists and members of the press for joining this national security briefing, exposing the presence of the Cuban regime's troops actually fighting for Russia in Ukraine. I would like to introduce a dear friend of all of ours and the cause of freedom everywhere in the world, Dr. Orlando Gutierrez Boronat. He's the National Secretary of El Directorio Democrático Cubano, who's going to serve as our moderator for this briefing. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank you, Orlando. Grateful for your leadership, for your hard work, for your dedication, for the cause of freedom of the Cuban people, but the cause of freedom and justice around the world. Thank you. And with that, let me turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for those remarks. Today's a very important briefing on the full participation of the Castro communist regime in the aggression against the people of Ukraine, a people that we profoundly admire. Just some housekeeping issues for the press. You will be in listen-only mode. After the conference, you will receive the full session recorded so that you may use it in your stories. I also want to say that for the purpose of the discussion after the briefing, I will serve as moderator. And I wanted to present those who are participating in this key briefing on the participation of the Castro communist regime in the aggression and the genocidal war against Ukraine. We have the Honorable Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, Vice Chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Chairman of the National Security Department of State Subcommittee in the House Appropriations Committee, and serves in the Defense Appropriations Committee. We also have the Honorable Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, Chairwoman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee in the House Committee on Foreign Relations, and serves in the House Committee on Financial Services. We have Honorable Congressman Carlos Jimenez, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security in the House Homeland Security Committee, and serves in the House Armed Services Committee. And as an observer, we also have Zygis Paviljonis, Lithuanian Member of Parliament, former ambassador of Lithuania to the US, and a champion of free Cuba around the world. Thank you, Zygis, for your support for a free Cuba. We also have present Rosa Maria Paya, the US Commissioner on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Very proud to have her here. We have Michael Savkiv, a great friend of a free Cuba, who is the president of the United Congress Committee of America, of the Ukrainian United Congress Committee of America. We also have here with us, on the Ukrainian side, Andriy Yusov, who is the spokesman for military intelligence of Ukraine and a champion of Ukrainian identity. We have Marian Zablotsky, who is a member of Parliament of Ukraine and the chair of the Free Cuba Caucus in the Ukrainian Parliament, a great friend of Free Cuba also. We have my dear friend, Alexander Moresko, who is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament and chairman of its Foreign Relations Committee, also a great friend of a Free Cuba. And Mr. Vladislav Vlasyuk, who is the advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky on international sanctions. So having introduced you, please begin with the briefing.
Шановні друзі, дякую за можливість виступити сьогодні перед такою поважною аудиторією.
Dear friends, thank you very much. It's an honor to present you before this honorable audience.
Дякуємо уряду та народу Сполучених Штатів за невпинну підтримку України в боротьбі проти загарбницької війни з боку Росії.
We are greatly thankful to the people of United States and the United States government for their support at the treacherous war against Russia against Ukraine.
Також бажаємо кубинському народу волі, демократії і справжнього незалежного урядування.
We also wish to the Cuban people the true freedom, democracy and truly democratic government.
І сьогодні ми говоримо про окрему велику проблему. Це іноземні громадяни, які завербовані, затягнуті Російською Федерацією для війни проти України.
Today we are talking about big problem, foreign mercenaries that have been dragged into the war by Russia against Ukraine.
І мова йде про понад близько 20 тисяч іноземних громадян, які воюють сьогодні на боці Росії.
We are currently talking at least about 20,000 different mercenaries fighting against Ukraine.
Серед них, на жаль, багато вихідців з Куби.
Unfortunately, a lot of them are from Cuba.
Власне, громадяни Куби входять в четвірку країн за кількістю іноземних громадян в армії Росії.
Cuba is ranked at the very top among the total number of source countries for mercenaries.
Зараз, за даними наших джерел, відомо про 20 тисяч осіб з Куби, яких завербували до російської армії, за інформацією з наших джерел.
Currently, our good intelligence tells us about at least 20,000 people who have already from Cuba that have already filled the documents and have been recruited to fight for Russia.
Із них за останній період підтверджено перекидання і доставку на фронт і безпосередню участь в бойових діях понад 1000 осіб.
We have been able to physically identify over 1,000 of those mercenaries.
Це громадяни Куби, які підписали контракт з російською армією. Їхні дані, особиста інформація повністю відома українським силам безпеки і оборони.
This is just the ones that identities of whom are for sure known, and they have signed contracts between June 2023 and February 2024, just for this 8 months period.
За необхідністю ви також матимете можливість з ними ознайомитись.
We will gladly share the identities of these confirmed mercenaries with you.
Слід також зауважити, що у майже 300 осіб із згаданих громадян Куби вже закінчились так звані контракти з російською армією.
We also know of at least 250 people whose contracts have actually expired.
Проте їх досі не звільнили, не відпустили і фактично силоміць утримують в лавах путінської армії.
But they have been defrauded, and despite the promises, they have not been let out of the Russian forces, and they are being kept there by force.
Відомо про значну кількість загиблих. Із загиблих 40 осіб ідентифіковані, їхні персональні дані і інформацію про них.
We know about significant numbers of those killed, of which we were able to positively identify the names of at least 40 people.
Так, враховуючи економічну ситуацію сьогоднішню на Кубі, одним з головних чинників, чому погоджуються на війну на боці Путіна, це економічний чинник.
The main factor why Cubans go to fight with Russia against Ukraine are the payouts, economics.
Середньомісячна оплата за участь в бойових діях для іноземних громадян в російській армії близько $2000 США.
The average monthly salary for Cuban mercenaries in Russia is $2,000 per month.
Для Сполучених Штатів це невелика сума, але для багатьох країн, що розвиваються, це значний аргумент.
It's not a significant amount of money, but for the impoverished people of Cuba, this is a significant argument.
Слід також зауважити, що середній вік іноземних громадян Куби, зокрема, які воюють за Путіна війни проти України, це 35 років.
The average age of the mercenaries is 35 years old from Cuba.
Це найбільш працездатний вік, це вік найбільшого розквіту для будь-якого чоловіка, вік, коли треба будувати сім'ю і піклуватись про своїх дітей.
This is the age where people should be building families and working hard, but unfortunately they choose to go for war.
Тим не менше, це саме той вік, коли гинуть і громадяни Куби в війні, в імперіалістичній війні Путіна проти України.
Unfortunately, this is the age at which young Cuban men die for the imperialist ambitions of Vladimir Putin.
За наявними даними, громадяни Куби в середньому гинуть в період 150 діб від підписання контракту.
By our data, the Cuban mercenaries on average die from between 140 and 150 days since signing the contract.
Багато загиблих протягом менше ніж місяця після підписання контракту.
There are a lot of deaths that die with less than a month after signing the contract.
Найкоротший відомий факт загибелі – це 7 діб від підписання контракту.
The shortest known period of death after signing the contract is 7 days.
Більшість загиблих гинуть під час першого бойового завдання.
Most of the dead are at the initial storm that they take part in.
Режим Путіна має багато аргументів, чому він залучає іноземних громадян.
it is beneficial for Putin's regime to attract Cuban mercenaries.
В разі загибелі іноземця Росія не несе жодної відповідальності.
So if a foreigner dies, there are no social payouts and no responsibility.
Немає соціального незадоволення в власній країні.
There are no relatives inside Russia who are unhappy with the war.
Є, безумовно, економія життів власних солдат.
And of course, less dead Russians.
Створюється пропагандистський міф про начебто глобальну підтримку дій Путіна.
And of course, a propaganda myth about global support of Putin's war.
І, звичайно, залучення одного іноземця коштує значно дешевше, ніж спорядження російського солдата.
And it's much cheaper to attract a Cuban mercenary rather than attract Russian soldiers.
Разом з тим, слід зауважити, що в багатьох випадках уряди країн, громадяни, яких опиняються в російській армії, і в Куби в тому числі, формально можуть не підтримувати такі дії Путіна, але фактично сприяють такій політиці путінського режиму.
Of course, Cuban regime does not formally support these activities, but with these numbers, it is impossible that without complicitness of Cuban government, these mercenaries would be in Russia.
Враховуючи закритий недемократичний режим, який є сьогодні на Кубі, така рекрутингова політика путінського режиму не могла би відбуватись без сприяння влади на Кубі.
Take into account the totalitarian nature of Cuban regime, such recruitment could not have taken part without the blessing of the Cuban regime.
Попри те, що фактично громадяни Куби потрапляють до російської армії часто шляхом обману і фактично потрапляють в рабство, з якого потім немає виходу.
Despite the fact that many of the mercenaries are being attracted there by fraud and often cannot get out later.
Україна зацікавлена в тому, щоб рятувати життя навіть тих людей, які потрапили до російської армії. Тому у нас працюють гуманітарні проекти, зокрема «Хочу жити», які працюють і рятують життя тих, хто готовий складати зброю.
Despite that, we are interested in saving even the lives of those falsely recruited, and we are running different projects like Stay Alive to help save those lives.
В рамках цього проекту було оприлюднено список із понад 10 тисяч осіб, що були завербовані Росією.
As part of this list, we published the list of 10,000 mercenaries that have been recruited by Russia from different countries.
Проблема путінської агресії носить глобальний характер.
So the Putin's aggression is quite global.
Як і проблема співпраці путінського режиму із державами-терористами.
As well as cooperation of Putin's regime with those states that are recognized as state sponsors of terror.
Тому Україна вдячна міжнародній спільноті і Сполученим Штатам Америки за увагу до цієї теми і за допомогу в боротьбі з цією глобальною загрозою.
So we are grateful to United States for helping us fight these terrorist forces.
Дякую.
Thank you. So, давайте. So, I think we have now the second presentation, which I will now do. Right. So this was the presentation from Andrei Yusov, the official spokesman of Ukraine's military intelligence. It is not the only agency that gathers data on Cuban mercenaries, so I wanted to share with you briefly some of the data that was also obtained by Ukrainians' foreign intelligence and special security services, as well as the volunteer hacking teams who try to get data from the Cuban regime and from the Russian government. Here you see, and we revealed this for the first time, the second captured Cuban mercenary. I shared with Orlando Boronat, my great friend, video of his capture. Previously, Orlando has been very supportive and has been helping us uncover that information. He interviewed the first captured Cuban mercenary, and using this opportunity, I invite him to interview the second captured one. Of course, you can see he has multiple entries in passports to Russia, which means that he's quite likely connected to the Cuban regime, as others, as you've heard, do not have that luxury. Next slide, please. Here is the list that Andrei Yusov has been talking about. So this only covers a period of 8 months of recruitment. 8 months, you see 1,000 people, and this is only from one unit, and it does not cover the years of recruitment that Russia has been doing. But as you can see, here is the list of 39 Cuban mercenaries killed, which is definitely only in a fraction. Simple extrapolation shows you that of those Cubans kills are in hundreds, and these are only confirmed killed Cubans. So of course, those missing in action would not be on that list. Next slide, please. Here I want to share with you some official letters that Cuban relatives have been sending to the Human Rights Ombudsman in Russia, although its definition sounds funny. Here, for example, you see Bermudez Sabugo Paola, I apologize for mispronouncing probably the name, but she's asking to recover their names and to find out the destiny of her husband, who disappeared on the 13th of January 2025 this year. She says that she has a young kid and is desperately searching for her. Her tragedy is that Russian government will not pay her anything, and neither will the Cuban government, as unfortunately he's both missing in action, not even formally dead, and of course, even if he's found dead, she will not receive any payouts. Next, please. Here you can see the first confirmed example of the recruitment of Cuban women. So it's not only men, but you can see that Ms. Garcia, Diane Gladys, she signed a contract with the Russian army on January 13th, 2025. She's getting here on the slide, you can see copy of her passport and copy of her contract. She's getting 195,000 rubles per month, which is just over $2,000 per month. Next slide, please. Here is something that has been Andrei Yusov been talking about. Here is a copy of the letter to the Human Rights Council of Russia of the Cuban mercenaries. Here you can see Julio Concepcion Ayala complaining that he has been in Russian army for a year. His contract has expired in January 2025. He hasn't been paid since December and is currently being held by force in Crimea, Feodosia. And he's asking to be released and to receive the payouts. This is just another personal example of Cubans being kept by Russians by force. Next slide, please. And here is a very telling story. This document comes from the court cases and criminal cases currently in Russian judicial system that our intelligence was able to get to. This is an interesting case of Yelena Smirnova. She's the recruiter for Russian army. And she's actually being charged in Russia for defrauding Cuban mercenaries. Here in this document, you see that she admits guilt to the fact that she embezzled the salaries of between 300 to 400 Cuban mercenaries. And for that, she's being charged with fraud. It turns out that some Cuban mercenaries actually complained about her formally to Russian authorities because they have not been receiving the salary. She took their credit cards and said that you owe me just for this favor of getting you here. But she asks to be relieved and not prosecuted. And in exchange, she says that she personally knows the data of 6,000 to 7,000 foreigners, mostly Cubans, that are ready to go to war if she's being released. As far as we know, that permission has been granted, and you can even see just from one confirmed recruiter how many in thousands they are promising to Russia in terms of mercenaries. That is it on my side. We will be happy to take questions later on if you'll have any.
Man, we're going to take the questions at the end of the briefings. If we can proceed to Alexander Maresko, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament.
Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you, dear friends. For me, it's a great honor to present my position on the issue which is being discussed right now, because it's a tremendously important issue for Ukraine. When we're talking about Russian aggression or the war of aggression against Ukraine, we should keep in mind that it's not only about aggression of one country against the other. Russia as a criminal, as a terrorist regime, has accomplices which help Russia to wage a war against Ukraine and help Russia to commit crimes against Ukrainian people. And these regimes which support Russia right now, from international legal point of view, they should be regarded as accomplices of the war crimes and other crimes committed by Russia. So when we're talking about Ukraine's war for independence, we should remember that there is a whole coalition of authoritarian and even totalitarian regimes fighting against Ukraine. Among these regimes are Belarusian regime of dictator Lukashenko, Iran, North Korea, China, which is providing lifeline to Russian war machine, and of course, Castro regime in Cuba. Castro regime in Cuba plays a special role in Latin America because I would say this is the major kind of arm of Russian terrorist regime in Latin America, and Castro regime helps Russia to wage a war against Ukraine, not only by providing troops which are sent to Ukrainian front, but also by spreading Russian propaganda in Latin America, helping politically, diplomatically, trying to undermine position of Ukraine among Latin American countries. So we're dealing with the axis of evil, which includes different countries and different regimes. And these countries which belong to this axis of evil, they have sort of their own solidarity. They help each other. They provide aid to each other. I believe that without Russian support, Castro regime would be doomed. But unfortunately, Russia is providing lifeline to the Castro regime in Cuba. I believe also that defeat of Russia will lead to bringing down Castro regime in Cuba and liberation of Cuban people. I also believe that we should recognize Castro regime in Cuba in the same way as Russia was recognized recently by the Council of Europe in the resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe as a terrorist regime, because they support each other, they are interlinked, and they help each other to commit crimes against Ukrainians. Unfortunately, inadvertently, some European countries and even the European Union might be helping Castro regime in Cuba by providing, for example, financial aid or financial support. In reality, this kind of support, even though it is covered by some kind of humanitarian reasons, but in reality, this kind of economic help helps to perpetuate Castro regime, helps to stay in power. And from my perspective, it's a mistake. That's why we should raise this issue before our European colleagues, before European Parliament, for example, and the European Union. Finally, I believe that Castro regime in Cuba and Russia are two sides of the same evil. And this is that's why it creates such danger for democracy and for freedom in many countries, including, of course, Ukraine and Latin America. On kind of personal note, almost each day I take my children to the kindergarten, and the building where the kindergarten is located it happens to be that it's located right next to the Cuban embassy in Kiev. And this embassy now looks absolutely empty. But each time when I pass by, I'm thinking to myself that I have this idea, this dream, or this vision that someday it will be an embassy of free Cuba, democratic Cuba, who will be a true friend of Ukraine. And this is one of the reasons why our colleagues and me have created this group of friends of free Cuba in Ukrainian parliament. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your attention.
We will now have Mr. Vladislav Vlasyuk, who is the advisor to President Zelensky on international sanctions, speak. And at the end, Brian Zablotsky will summarize the statements made by these Ukrainian colleagues from Kyiv.
Thank you very much. First of all, dear Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time. As said by my colleagues, this is entirely true that all the American people, as well as the Congress of America, has been truly supportive from the very beginning of this war. Of course, a lot of discussions been held on different topics. The sanctions being usually one of the central topics for the waves of supporting Ukraine and oppressing Russian regime. And I wanted to remind that in the very beginning, on the full-scale invasion, there has been a very broad discussion about the recognizing Russia as a state securities, as a state sponsor of terrorism. And as you, of course, know, there are some other states also recognized as state sponsor of terrorism, Cuba among those. And we must say that this, let's say, connectivity between some of these SST states has been truly remarkable. And that means a lot also by means of sanctions and circumventing of sanctions. So we think that given the recent developments and, this, let's say, clear appetite of many for the new ways to introduce new measures against Russia, against some other states, to make the global world safer. We've been thinking about looking to the avenue, what can be done in the area of introducing, say, sanctions or secondary sanctions, or maybe tariffs for those of the countries who've been cooperating duly with the state sponsor of terrorism, which will automatically mean that should the Russia continue a cooperation with Cuba, as very well shown by my colleagues, that should also be another, say, regime or another ground for introducing extra sanctions leverage against Russia. So, but that would of course mean that there is a need for a new piece of legislation to be adopted. We think that makes a good opportunity to send a clear and strong signal to the politicum of the United States, saying that yes, of course, the vast majority of the congressmen is with Ukraine, the vast majority of Ukraine is with the Cuban people, and the sanctions can also be very helpful and very helpful to work this situation out. I must also say that the sanctions really work. I might imagine that you probably have like different opinions about the effectiveness of sanctions, and of course we are on the very same page about the let's say that a little bit more of sanctions pressure could potentially be done. And we are very supportive about the ideas of President Trump himself that more of the sanctions should be done, including the tariffs against those buyers of Russian oil. We are very much supportive, and we have very good coordination and consultations in between the US government and the UK government, as well as the European Union government, talking about all those issues. Just very briefly, we believe that from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has already lost at least 160 billions because of the sanctions against gas and oil. That also means that Russia should be losing even more if we introduce some further sanctions or tariffs. We are very much expecting in the coming days the new sanctions packages in the first place from the EU and quite likely from the US government as well. This is not mentioning just the tariffs. And this is very important. The other, let's say, sanction topic in relation to this gathering, it is that the sanction circumvention. It also happens. It also happens through the mentioned axis. So we have this Iran, we have the North Korea, we have Cuba, and that is truly remarkable how much of the components, the critical components, the microchip, the other stuff comes to Russia from these directions, plus China, of course, and that is something that really and truly helps Russian military defense sector to continue the level of manufacturing of the weapons and of the other stuff they use at the battlefield. Plus, what we think is also worth to be considered, it is the issue of the sovereign assets. We know very well that there is a vast amount of the money immobilized effectively since the full-scale invasion. Those money which are sovereign money of or sovereign assets of Russian Federation. You of course also know that Russia has been supporting Cuban regime with money for a long time, including forgiving the debts. And we think that that is also another very good leverage, which is in the hands of President Trump, as well as in the hands of the other leaders of G7 countries. This is the sovereign assets, and we think that the countries alike Russia and the other terrorist regimes, as I call them, they should be really facing the confiscation of those assets. So should you be willing to have any extra information about either sanctions or second sanctions or the oil and gas related sanctions or the asset confiscation issue, I will be more than happy to answer the questions. But any of these issues, any of that can have some further development, can have some further steps discussed, and that would altogether mean extra pressure against Russia, thus leading Mr. Putin to come to sit to the table and to actually talk about the peace negotiation. Again, thank you so much for your support and thank you for this excellent opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And I would like to ask Marian Zablotsky, Member of Parliament of Ukraine and Chair of the Free Cuba Caucus of that parliament, to state the final remarks for the briefing from our Ukrainian colleagues from the city of Kyiv.
Thank you very much. Just extending our gratitude, and to you, Orlando, in particular. I just wanted to end up with two concrete proposals. First, me and Orlando were already in Brussels several times, and I talked to members of European Parliament about the EU funding to Cuba. I showed the copies of passports of Cuban mercenaries, and I specifically asked them, will continue to advocate for that funding to stop. On our side, if possible, we'd like to ask to create a continued working group with you to share further and continue the intelligence that we constantly gather about Cuban mercenaries, and to maybe develop some legislation that can help at least Russia stop the use of the states sponsors of terror. Because currently, for example, 60% of artillery shells in Russia come from North Korea. Without North Korean artillery shells, they are done. Most of the damage to our infrastructure comes from Iranian drones. By the way, they are partly assembled in Venezuela. That's another topic. And the second biggest number of troops after North Korean are Cuban. Actually, without the military support from state sponsors of terror, Russia would have stopped their attack already. And there are different questions. So, for example, Terrorist Risks and Insurance and Protection Act allows for the compensation of U.S. citizens in case they are part of terror. But, for example, 93 Americans died while fighting for Ukraine, and they cannot have compensation because they are fighting against Russia. But if that bill is amended, maybe the families of those 93 brave American soldiers who volunteered to fight for us, maybe they can get compensation. So something very concrete that we would like to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marian. Before passing on to the remarks or questions by the honorable members of Congress and Commissioner Paya, I would like to very briefly summarize some of the key ideas and facts expressed in today's briefing. There have been some very powerful revelations made by the Ukrainian delegation here present. Number one, they have very specific information on the thousands of Cuban communist troops participating in the aggression against Ukraine, possibly the second largest foreign contingent after the North Koreans. The undeniable involvement of the Castro regime in mobilizing these thousands of troops has been very clearly stated in this briefing. Chairman Moresco has said that the Ukraine delegation will present before the Council of Europe a resolution to term the Cuban regime as a terrorist state, just like the Russian state has been termed a terrorist state by the Council of Europe. That hundreds of Cubans have been killed so far in Ukraine. Many of the identities and the deaths are not being confirmed by the Russians in order to not have to pay their families further compensation. There is rampant mistreatment of these Cuban troops by the Russian military command. There's also evidence, as has been studied here, of the laundering of Russian money through the Cuban regime in Latin America. The full participation of the Cuban regime in the axis of evil against Ukraine has been fully explained and details given. Ukraine will be seeking to introduce sanctions against the Cuban regime in the upcoming new package of sanctions by the European Union, and they were very explicit in the different types of sanctions that they were asking to be implemented. Having said this and having gone over these different revelations and proposals, I would like to pass on to any member of Congress who would like to make a statement.
Thank you. Let me actually start by those who have participated, start by expressing how we appreciate how heroic the Ukrainian people have been standing up against this aggression, and we know how difficult but just again the Ukrainians have shown heroism that I think will be recorded by history. So first, my gratitude to these heroes and to our colleagues who are on the other side of this conversation via video. Really three questions or two or three questions. Number one is I really like what I heard about asking for the designation of the Cuban regime to be designated for what it is, which is a terrorist state. And as you know, the United States already does that for a large number of reasons. The United States deals with this regime just 90 miles away. We're very aware that it is a terrorist state, so it would be helpful for Europe to do the same thing. And so that's noted and appreciated. But here's the other thing that I think is important to note. Many European states continue to help fund the Castro regime, whether it's through extending credit or to forgive debt. And we see that time and time and time again. And I will tell you that, you know, when we talk to the American taxpayer, the question arises, well, if Europe is serious, as it should be, to defeat Putin in this act of aggression, and it asks the United States taxpayer to send weaponry and funding to help do that with one hand, but on the other hand, Europe is also helping to fund directly through credits, through debt forgiveness, through this political dialogue and cooperation agreement, which is nothing more than the legitimization of the terrorist regime 90 miles away from the United States. Why should the American taxpayer be sending money with one hand that the Europeans are asking for, while the Europeans, on the other hand, are helping to fund directly a regime that is actually sending troops to fight for the Russians in Ukraine? It doesn't make sense. It's not acceptable. Now, again, I'm not referring obviously to our Ukrainian colleagues who are on the line now, but I just think it's very important, and I've had these conversations, a lot of us have these conversations with our European allies, that those days have to be over. You cannot, on one hand, ask for funding and help from the United States to fight Putin, and on the other hand, those same people that are asking for the funds, for the help, our European friends, are helping to fund Putin's strongest ally in the Western Hemisphere. That has to end. That is unsustainable and it is unacceptable. But again, my gratitude to all of you who are heroic and for this very important presentation, and know that you have my deep admiration, and I look forward to continue working with you. Orlando, I yield back.
I would like to ask members of the Ukrainian delegation to please respond to Congressman Diaz-Balart's questions and remarks.
If I may, I completely agree, and we've already taken steps. And I think the first visit we've done with Orlando to Brussels regarding that funding was in 2023, if I remember correctly. And we are very much willing to continue to advocate that forward. After this briefing, I would also like to share some information with you regarding how much Cuban regime is also earning from consulate services in other countries and also including in US. That's why I proposed a working group. I would like to share further information that wasn't shared here before, so we can work against this excess of evil.
Congressman Jimenez.
Thank you. And this has been very informative. Some things that I knew, some things that I didn't know for sure. I knew that the Cuban regime is a puppet of Russia. Will do anything and do the bidding of Russia, including sending its own, young men to fight for Russia, even though those young men may not even know what the heck they're getting into, and be basically slaves. One question: do the funds that supposedly are being paid for each of these fighters, did they actually go to the fighters, or is it being sent to Cuba? And then Cuba reaps the benefit of those funds versus those fighters. Not that those fighters should be there, but we see the same thing with Cuban doctors, where the regime sends out thousands of Cuban doctors to different countries, and then charges a $10,000 a month per doctors. The doctors never see any of that money. It goes right into the coffers of the Cuban regime. So I wonder if the same kind of arrangement is made with these fighters. In line with my colleague, Representative Diaz-Balart, the number one source, or one of the biggest sources of funds for Russia, is their energy. Are you working with the European Union to stop any of the European Union members are actually purchasing Russian energy? Because then that is directly funding the war, against Ukraine. And again, it's hypocritical that they're asking for us to give money and arms to Europe and to help in the Ukrainian cause. At the same time, they're actually helping the Russian cause against Ukraine. And is the European Union willing to do some of the things that we're doing here in the United States, such as probably the largest purchaser of Russian energy may be India? Are they willing to step up and put sanctions against those countries? Maybe not. And China? We're still dealing with China, and the best way to stop this aggression is to starve them of money. And what is the number one way? The energy. The other thing that we have to do too is start purchasing more American energy, drive the cost of energy down, which then Russian energy will be worth less, and they won't be able to perpetrate this war. And so this has got to be in all the above. All the options have to be on the table. Maximum pressure against the Cuban regime, against Russia. As you know, the three of us are solidly behind you and the people of Ukraine in your fight for freedom. We know what Russia is about, the Russian government is about. I'm not talking about the Russian people. I'm talking about the Russian government is all about. They've been oppressing our people for over 60 years. And so we'll be in this fight for you. But if you could also help us in our fight for freedom in Cuba, and eventually that helps you, because there won't be any more Cubans going to Ukraine. There won't be an ally of Russia here in our hemisphere. And so, let's help each other in our fight against. We'll help you in your fight for freedom, and you can help us in trying to liberate, the Cuban people from oppression. And so again, anything that the Ukrainian government can do to express those thoughts to European Union, because we do see this schizophrenic kind of action from the Europeans. On one hand, they talk about how much they want to help Ukraine. On the other hand, they're actively helping the Russian war cause by purchasing energy, et cetera, helping their allies, especially here in the Western Hemisphere. And everybody has to stand up and be counted. You're on one side or on the other. There is no gray here. You're with Ukraine or you're against Ukraine. And if you're with Ukraine, you're going to have to take the measures necessary to weaken Russia as much as possible. And with that, again, thank you. And again, you have my deepest admiration for the fight that you have, and that your fight for freedom, and know that you have a lot of support here in U.S. Congress.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to say that the three members of Congress speak for an entire community which stands with Ukraine. As you know, two large humanitarian drives have been carried out by the committee in support of Ukraine, and we're glad to support you in the struggle against the same power that, like the Congressman said, has been oppressing Cubans for over 60 years. Is there anyone in the Ukraine delegation who wishes to respond to the questions and remarks by Congressman Jimenez?
I can answer a very specific question about the Cuban contracts, and probably Vladislav Vasuk will better answer about sanctions. Each of the mercenaries promised 195,000 rubles per, well, roughly $2,000 per month. In my presentation, I already showed the cases that those salaries are being embezzled, first of all, by Russians themselves. I would not be surprised if they are not embezzled by the Cuban regime. But I think the most likely thing is that if you look closely, currently Russia pays tens of thousands of dollars of signing bonus to their citizens. My guess is that most likely cost that they have with Cuban regime is just that per signed contract, Cuban regime gets something. I think that in their mafia mindset, that's the only way it would work. I would kindly ask Vladislav Lasuk to explain more about oil, etc. But as far as I know, oil was only purchased by, let's say, countries relative, well, the countries that have been present in the latest Beijing military parade, so Hungary and Slovakia, so to say. We would be happy if everything stops, but I think it takes time. And yesterday we had a speech in our parliament from the chairwoman of European Parliament that she promised to quicken that abolition.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Your Excellency, for this question. First of all, I totally and truly agree to the words about no gray zone there. This is very much what we've been feeling since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. There is no gray zone. There is either with Ukraine or against Ukraine. So this is very much true. At the same time, the reality is that there are two large buyers of Russian oil, which are the China and India. And especially the case of India is remarkable because they've never been buying any of Russian oil before 2022, and they started to buy the Russian oil just after the full-scale invasion. Why? Because actually EU has banned the maritime shipments of the Russian oil entirely, which kind of pushed on Russia to divert its exports, and the India just taken an advantage and tried to get most of the discount. And yes, of course, we totally agree that the buyers of the Russian oil should be punished in a way, or say it mildly, stimulated to cut off these buyings, at least to adhere to the oil price cap and to pay much less of the money to the aggressor state, if not at all. We've been working with this with the American government. We've been working with these arguments and ideas with the EU. I must say that some certain progress is there, but of course we have to speed up. And at the same time, and that is the position which we are on the same page with the EU and with the UK. We have not to limit ourselves with this binary option, either tariffs against China or no measures at all. Which I mean that of course tariffs would be the most powerful tool, but in the meantime we should continue pushing with the interim sanctions, secondary sanctions against the refineries in India or in China, secondary sanctions against the operators, the shadow fleet of oil tankers. So all of that should be responded with sanctions before the EU can actually take this decision on the tariffs on the India or China, which I must say will be quite difficult. And in any way, given the format how the EU takes any decision, which is the unanimous decision, that's going to be the hard decision. But of course, we are totally supportive of that. Thank you.
Does any other member of the Ukraine delegation wish to address the remarks by Congressman Jimenez? Congresswoman Salazar.
Thank you to Orlando Gutierrez for putting together this very important Zoom. And on behalf of the Cubans and in South Florida, which we three of us represent, we want to salute the Ukrainians because we understand that your fight has been monumental, and we want to salute you and encourage you to continue it. I was talking to a very good friend of ours, Victoria Sparks, who is the Ukrainian American, or the only Ukrainian American in Congress. And I was telling her that you guys lived communism, but you experienced freedom for 30 years. So that is why you are so gung-ho and so full of energy and courage to fight the Russians off again, because you tasted freedom. That's exactly what we want for the Cuban people. And I'm sure that if the Cuban people would be in the position of the Ukrainians right now, they would be fighting the Russians with the same energy, because we know, and the Cubans that live on the island know what living under oppression and communism is all about. So once again, on behalf of South Florida and the Cubans that live in the districts that we represent, we want to send you our hearts are with you. That's my first message. I also want to second what my colleagues have said, that the Europeans need to hear from the Ukrainians that the Ukrainians and the Cubans are the same thing, that we need to fend off the Russians and everything that it's related to Putin and the Soviet Empire, ex-Soviet, the Soviet Empire that he's trying to put together again. So it's very important on behalf of the Cuban people that you will express that thought to the rest of the Europeans, that as Mario Díaz-Balart said, sometimes they're on the fence, sometimes they help with the Castro regime or a Cuban revolution, other times they are with the people, the Cubans that want to be free, whether it's in the island or in Miami and in South Florida or anywhere else in the world. We have millions and millions of Ukrainians out of Ukraine, and you have the same number of Cubans out of the island for the same reason. So I wanted to ask you to please remember that when you are talking to the European Union. Very important for us to send that message loud and clear. And the last thing I wanted to ask you is, could someone explain how is the average Cuban that wants to make $2,000 a month going to Ukraine? Can you explain to us what is the process? Why they don't get paid? What are they promised? What is promised to them for them to take that jump and going from Havana or from Cuba to Ukraine, and then realizing that what they were promised, it's all a fallacy or a lie? Could you just go into that a little bit more in detail? And thank you very much for being here with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Before members of the Ukraine delegation respond to the Congresswoman's questions and remarks, I want to say that we're running out of time in the presentation, and I would like to pass on to Commissioner Paya for any question or remarks she may have. So please answer Congresswoman Salazar, and I would like to have also Commissioner Paya address you and perhaps ask questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We continue to hold on. And as I told to the press recently, actually, the life under Russian bombs is actually better than the life of ordinary Cubans under the Russian occupation. For example, you can see that I still have electricity, at least, even while our infrastructure is being bombed. To answer the specific questions, so the information on the Cuban recruiters, our forces and volunteers were able to hack the emails of two recruiters. One is a Russian military intelligence officer. It was in 2023. He was present at the Russian military base in Cuba, and he was given a go-ahead to recruit. There are a number of these recruiters, so we were able to seize 260 passports from him, copies from his email. The other recruiter I showed you in the presentation, so a woman, she brought probably a few thousand Cubans to Russia and was embezzling salaries from 300 or 400 people, as she admitted later in court herself. So that's how it's happening. The regime is allowing Russian recruiters, Russian military officers to reign free in Cuba and do whatever they want. Then they are put on flights to Sheremetyevo or Moscow, and that's how they get into Russia.
Thank you.
I'd like to emphasize the importance of what Marin Zablosky has just revealed here about the precise information they have on Russian recruiters in Cuba. It's a stunning revelation. Commissioner Paya, would you like to address the Ukraine delegation?
Yes, thank you so much, Orlando, for convening this this briefing. Thank you so much, Congressman, Congresswoman, for providing the opportunity, and of course to all the honorable gentlemen at the other side of the Atlantic for give us this information. Thank you for inviting me as commissioner-elect. I am also a Cuban citizen, and just echoing what the Congresswoman just mentioned, I want to say how the Cuban people at large respect and admire the sacrifice and the courage of the Ukrainian people, and is only adding to the tragedy that you are enduring, the tragedy of Cuban young men and women joining the Russian army and dying in this war of aggression against Ukraine. I have to say that the numbers that you have revealed today are just exceed by a lot the calculus that we had in mind, and encourage you, as it has been previously said, to share this with the members of the Council of Ministers at the European Union, which is government that sits around that table, as much as with the European External Action Service, as dear friend Congressman Alexander Mereshko mentioned. The Cuban regime has been the best transatlantic ally to the Putin regime in this war of aggression, and its activities has surpassed what we just heard, because they are also helping with the propaganda and disinformation in the Americas, but also in Europe through their propaganda machinery and sources as Cuba Visión Internacional or Prensa Latina, and also especially concerned about the other ways of payment that the Russian regime could have towards the Cuban regime. Chief of Intelligence Narinsky was just in Havana with the dictator Díaz-Canel, and we know that from the beginning of this war of aggression in 2022, the military and intelligence alliance between the Cuban regime and the Russian regime was threatening. So any information that you could have on that regard would be also very, very helpful. And just to finish, I have to say that it's not possible, and I'm saying this as a Cuban citizen, it's not possible that a strategy and an operation of this size can take place in Cuba without the participation, direct participation, facilitation, coordination, I would venture to say direction of the Cuban regime, and direct involvement in sending these young men and women to the Russian army, and that's also a tragedy for the Cuban people. My colleagues have received the call of despair of the mothers and the wife of those that have been missing in this war, and they never recovered their bodies or any information about their remainings. With that, I would love to hear if there is a way to have more information about that, about also those that are now stuck because their contracts expired, but they are still stuck in the war. If there is any way to interject that process. And finally, as this cannot take place without the participation of the Cuban regime, if you have any idea on how many acting military Cuban officials are actually in the ground in Ukraine or in Russia, collaborating with the Russian army. Thank you again. Thank you so much. And with that, I yield back. Orlando, gracias.
Commissioner, thank you for your perspective and your inside knowledge of how the Cuban regime operates. I would like to, for one final time, go to the Ukrainian delegation for any final remarks before we adjourn this very productive session of information and revelation about the extent of the Castro regime's involvement in the genocidal war against Ukraine.
Just a 30-second remark, and I will yield to my colleagues. For sure, you can count on our support about raising these issues in Brussels. I've been doing that with Orlando since 2023. We will continue doing that. We have a common cause. You can count on us on fighting the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranian drones, and unfortunately, the Cuban troops. We also very much hope that the US Cuban Americans will continue raising the issue of support for Ukraine among Congress, among especially the Republican Congress. And as you know, it's not always easy for us. We should stay together, and we really, really count on your further support for further potential sanctions. And again, I repeat our idea to maybe develop a new legislation that puts secondary sanctions if one uses some significant military aid from state sponsors of terror, like Cuba. Thank you.
Congressman Diaz-Balart, thank you for convening this very productive session this morning.
Well, actually, let me just thank all of my colleagues, our colleagues across the Atlantic, my colleagues from Congress here. Commissioner, always a privilege to be with you. Orlando, again, your leadership, your steadfast commitment to the cause of freedom. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention another colleague who I believe is also on, Zigimantis Pavilionis, who is a freedom fighter and one of my heroes, I believe, is also on. So with that, Orlando, thank you. And we will continue to be in touch.
I want to thank the Ukraine delegation for being present at such a high level, and thank you for the information you have provided. And thank you, members of Congress, for being here, and Commissioner Paya.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it.